On the evening of November 14, 2022, in a quiet agricultural town in Santa Catarina, Brazil, a 43-year-old cattle rancher and driver named Voldemir Heckler sat down to what witnesses would later describe as an ordinary dinner. By the next morning, he had vanished. His employer reported him missing when he failed to appear for work. A man known for reliability, suddenly gone without explanation. Within 5 days, investigators would make a discovery so disturbing it would dominate Brazilian news cycles for months. Voldemir's body frozen and concealed beneath layers of packaged food in his own home freezer placed there by the woman who had called police to report him missing, his wife Claudia Fernandez Tabares. This is not a story of a single violent act, but of 2 decades of entangled lives. Obsessive surveillance, financial desperation, and a crime that turned a family home into a crime scene so macabre that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the psychology behind it. Before we descend into the darker corridors of this investigation, subscribe if you're drawn to true crime documentaries that prioritize facts over sensationalism, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's return to the beginning, to understand how a man's attempt to live 2 lives simultaneously would ultimately cost him everything. Voldemir Heckler was born in 1979 in the rural interior of Santa Catarina, one of Brazil's southern states known for its German and Italian immigrant communities, rolling farmland, and a culture that prizes hard work and family loyalty. The exact date of his birth remains undocumented in public records, a detail that reflects the informal nature of rural Brazilian life in that era, where not every family registered births immediately or maintained meticulous records. He grew up in a large sibling group, learning early the rhythms of agricultural life, tending livestock, repairing equipment, understanding that survival depended on labor and mutual support. By his early 20s, Voldemir had earned a reputation in his community as dependable and good-natured, the kind of man neighbors called when they needed help moving cattle or fixing a fence. He worked as a driver, transporting goods across the region's winding rural roads, and supplemented that income by raising cattle on leased pasture land, a common arrangement in areas where land ownership was often fractured across extended families. In his mid-20s, he married Jeanette, a woman from a nearby town, and together they began building what appeared to be a stable, conventional family. Their first son, Jonathan, was born in the late 1990s, followed a few years later by Mateus. For a time, their home reflected the image many in their community aspired to: a working man, providing for his wife and children, a household anchored by routine and modest prosperity. But beneath that surface, a parallel reality was forming, one that Jeanette would not discover until it was too late to prevent the fracture it would cause. When Mateus was barely 1 year old, Voldemir sat Jeanette down and confessed something that shattered the foundation of their marriage. He had been involved with another woman, Claudia Fernandez Tabares, a former schoolteacher who had transitioned into work related to dairy cattle operations, and that relationship had produced a daughter. The child's name was Gabriela, and she had been born only months after Mateus. The timing was precise and devastating. Voldemir had not simply strayed. He had maintained a sustained double life, dividing his time, his affection, and his financial resources between 2 households. For Jeanette, the revelation was not just about infidelity. It was about the systematic deception required to sustain such an arrangement. How many evenings had he claimed to be working late or visiting family, when in fact he was with Claudia and their infant daughter? How many lies had he constructed to keep these 2 worlds separate? The betrayal cut deep, but Jeanette's response was not immediate separation. In a decision that would shape the next 2 decades, she chose not to pursue a divorce. Her reasons were complex and rooted in both hope and cultural context. In many Brazilian rural communities, particularly those influenced by Catholic traditions, divorce carried social stigma, and the economic realities for single mothers were harsh. Jeanette hoped, perhaps irrationally, that Voldemir would eventually abandon his second family and return fully to their home. That hope was never realized. Instead, Voldemir moved in with Claudia to care for their newborn daughter, leaving Jeanette and his sons in a state of limbo, neither fully separated nor together, their lives suspended in painful ambiguity. Claudia Fernandez Tabares, at this point in the story, remains a figure we know primarily through the perspectives of others. But certain facts about her background emerge from court documents and witness statements. She had worked as a teacher before transitioning to roles in the agricultural sector, specifically related to dairy farming, which was how she likely met Voldemir, whose cattle business intersected with those operations. When Gabriella was born, Claudia left formal employment to focus entirely on raising their daughter, a decision that made her financially dependent on Voldemir. This dependency would become a recurring theme in the years to come. Claudia's livelihood, her housing, her daily survival were tied directly to Voldemir's willingness to provide. And here is where the story takes on its first layers of psychological complexity. Claudia knew from the beginning that Voldemir was married, that he had 2 sons, that she was entering an arrangement that would never be fully legitimate in the eyes of the law or the community. Yet she chose to proceed, to have his child, to build a life around a man who could never be entirely hers. Some might see this as a tragic miscalculation. Others might view it as calculated risk. What is undeniable is that it created a volatile dynamic, one in which Claudia's sense of security was perpetually threatened by the existence of Jeanette and her sons. The children, innocent bystanders in the adults' decisions, began to form their own connections. Gabriella, as she grew from infancy into childhood, was brought by Voldemir to visit Jonathan and Matthias. The 3 half-siblings played together, shared meals, created memories that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them. For Jonathan and Matthias, their half-sister was not an abstraction or a symbol of their father's betrayal. She was simply Gabriella, a little girl who laughed and ran and needed the same care any child did. This is an important detail because it complicates the narrative that would later emerge. These were not warring factions, but deeply interconnected lives, and any resolution that destroyed one part would inevitably damage the others. Jeanette, for her part, faced a daily psychological ordeal. Claudia, according to multiple accounts from family members and later from Jeanette herself in police statements, did not accept the situation gracefully. She could not tolerate the fact that Voldemir continued to see Jeanette, continued to fulfill his obligations to his sons, continued to maintain emotional and financial ties to his first family. Claudia's response was to surveil, to follow, to intrude. Jeanette described episodes that bordered on stalking, being followed through town, being watched during family gatherings, receiving relentless phone calls to her home. This was before the widespread adoption of caller ID in rural Brazil, so answering the phone meant risking verbal assault. Jeanette's mother, who lived with them periodically, would pick up the receiver to hear Claudia's voice hurling insults, claiming that Voldemir was disgusted by Jeanette, that she was merely a housekeeper in his eyes, that the real relationship was with Claudia. These were not isolated incidents, but a sustained campaign of psychological harassment that lasted for years. One particular incident, recounted by Jeanette in later interviews with investigators and local media, illustrates the extremity of Claudia's behavior. Jeanette's mother was celebrating a birthday, and Voldemir had agreed to drive Jeanette and their sons to the party. As they traveled along the rural highways, Claudia appeared behind them in her own vehicle. She did not simply follow at a distance. She maneuvered aggressively, changing lanes to ensure she remained visible, accelerating and decelerating to match their pace. The pursuit lasted for miles, and at one point, Jeanette felt compelled to crouch down in the front seat to avoid being seen, a humiliating act that underscored the power Claudia wielded through sheer persistence. Eventually, Voldemir managed to lose her by taking a series of unexpected turns, but the psychological impact lingered. Jeanette would later describe the experience as feeling hunted, as if her own movements were never truly private. This was not an isolated case. Claudia appeared at homes where Voldemir and Jeanette were visiting mutual friends, forcing him to hide or leave abruptly to avoid public confrontation. She called their home at all hours, sometimes multiple times per day, exploiting the fact that anyone might answer. Jeanette, her mother, even occasionally one of the boys. The content of these calls was consistently cruel, designed to undermine Jeanette's sense of worth and security. Claudia would boast about intimate details of her relationship with Voldemir, claim that he complained about Jeanette's appearance or domestic skills, paint a picture of a man trapped in an obligation rather than a marriage. Whether these claims were true is impossible to verify. Voldemir is dead, and Jeanette has consistently maintained that her husband treated her with respect during their time together, that the man Claudia described was not the man she knew. Eventually, the strain became unbearable for Jeanette. In a moment of exhausted resignation, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. She gathered Voldemir's belongings, his clothes, his personal items, the mundane detritus of a shared life, and delivered them to Claudia's doorstep. It was not a legal separation, not a divorce, but a practical one. Voldemir, faced with his possessions literally on another woman's porch, moved in with Claudia permanently. This occurred sometime in the early 2010s, though the exact year is not recorded in available documents. From that point forward, the house Voldemir shared with Claudia became his primary residence. Yet his relationship with his sons did not end. Jonathan and Matthias, by now teenagers navigating their own educations and early adult lives, continued to see their father regularly. They visited his home, shared meals, attended family barbecues. Voldemir, to his credit in this regard, did not abandon his financial responsibilities. He continued to provide for their schooling, their needs, their futures. Jeanette herself visited occasionally, and witnesses consistently described these interactions as cordial. Voldemir did not treat Jeanette with hostility or contempt. He spoke to her with the residual respect of someone who had once loved her and who recognized the sacrifices she had made. This nuance is critical to understanding the later claims that would emerge about his character. Voldemir was a man capable of maintaining complex, even contradictory relationships without resorting to overt cruelty toward the women in his life. Whether that makes his actions moral is another question, but it does suggest that the portrait of him as a violent tyrant, which Claudia would later paint, is at minimum incomplete. As the years passed, a strange equilibrium formed. The fractured family found ways to coexist. On certain weekends, Voldemir would organize barbecues at his home, and both sides of his family would attend: Jeanette, Jonathan, Matthias, Gabriella, and Claudia. In those moments, Voldemir's personality shone through. He was known for his humor, his easy laugh, his ability to lighten a room. Friends and relatives consistently describe him as jovial, someone who could diffuse tension with a joke, who brought people together despite the awkwardness of the situation. Jonathan, as he entered adulthood, married and started his own family. He and his wife had 3 young children, Voldemir's grandchildren, who became regular visitors to their grandfather's home. Matthias, younger and still finding his path, also visited monthly. These were not obligatory, resentment-filled visits. By all accounts, the sons genuinely enjoyed their father's company. Gabriella's trajectory, however, diverged. As she approached her late teenage years, the tension in the household where she lived with her mother and Voldemir became increasingly apparent. When she turned 18, she made the decision to leave home and live independently. Some family members later suggested that Gabriella's departure was motivated by the oppressive atmosphere created by Claudia's controlling behavior, but others, including Claudia herself, would claim it was Voldemir's jealousy and disapproval of Gabriella's desire for independence that drove the rift. The truth, as is often the case in family conflicts, likely contains elements of both narratives. What is clear is that Gabriella's bond with her father weakened after her departure, while her relationship with her mother remained strong. This would prove significant in the aftermath of the crime, when Gabriella faced an unimaginable choice about where to place her loyalty. In mid-2022, after more than 2 decades of cohabitation, Voldemir and Claudia formalized their relationship through marriage. The ceremony was a small affair, and the motivations behind it remain unclear. Did Voldemir finally feel compelled to legitimize their union after so many years? Was there financial or legal pressure, perhaps related to inheritance or property? Or was it Claudia who pushed for the formality, seeking the security that legal marriage provided? We do not know. What we do know is that this period coincided with another major event in Voldemir's life, the death of his father. The loss was profound, not just emotionally, but practically. Voldemir's father had owned substantial rural property, and his passing triggered the complex process of dividing inherited land among multiple siblings. In Brazilian rural families, such divisions are often sources of bitter conflict, and Voldemir's case was no exception. Some assets were not directly registered in his name, but were managed through his sons or trusted associates, a common strategy in regions where informal arrangements often supersede legal documentation. These financial complexities created fresh tensions within the extended family, and at least one of Voldemir's sisters would later file a complaint against him, accusing him of violent behavior. However, investigators who examined that complaint found it to be rooted primarily in disputes over land division, rather than genuine concerns about physical abuse. This detail is important because it demonstrates that Voldemir's character was not uniformly seen as threatening, even by those who had grievances against him. Despite the familial tensions, Voldemir maintained a steady income through his driving work, collected a modest pension, and continued his cattle operations. He spoke often of his plans to invest his inheritance into purchasing more land, of expanding his operations, of building something substantial to pass on to his children. These were not the words or plans of a man contemplating disappearance or self-destruction. They were the ambitions of someone planning for the future. In early November 2022, just days before Voldemir's disappearance, Jonathan and his family visited the home where Voldemir now lived with Claudia. Jonathan had never fully trusted Claudia, a sentiment he made clear to relatives. He viewed her as excessively controlling, someone who monitored his father's movements and decisions with an intensity that felt invasive. Yet Jonathan maintained civility, choosing to focus on spending time with his father rather than provoking conflict. That particular weekend, friends of Voldemir and Claudia also joined the gathering, and the atmosphere was relaxed. They ate together, laughed, shared stories. The group stayed up late, and Jonathan's family decided to spend the night rather than drive home in the dark along rural roads. Nothing about that evening suggested the horror that would unfold within days. But the following week, something changed. By Tuesday, November 15, 2022, both Jonathan and Mateus noticed that their father had gone silent. He was not responding to calls or messages, which was unusual but not yet alarming. By Wednesday, however, concern escalated. Voldemir had failed to show up for work, an unprecedented lapse for a man known for his reliability and punctuality. His employer, unsettled by the absence, contacted Claudia to ask if something had happened. Claudia's response was immediate and seemingly cooperative. She did not know where Voldemir was, and she was worried. Within hours, she filed a missing person report with the local civil police, setting in motion an investigation that would, within days, turn into a homicide case. The news of Voldemir's disappearance did not reach Jeanette and her sons directly. Instead, a mutual acquaintance called them with the unsettling update, and Jonathan's immediate reaction was panic. His mind raced through possibilities. Had his father collapsed while working in the fields? Had he suffered a heart attack or stroke, lying incapacitated somewhere beyond the reach of cell phone signals? Jonathan, Mateus, and Jeanette mobilized quickly, driving to the rural areas Voldemir frequented, calling out his name, searching along fence lines and irrigation ditches. Hours passed with no sign of him. As the search continued, rumors began to circulate through the tight-knit community. Some whispered that Voldemir might have taken his own life, a theory that his family rejected vehemently. They knew him as a cheerful man, full of plans, financially stable, deeply connected to his children. Suicide, they insisted, was unthinkable. A more plausible explanation in their minds was that he had left temporarily, perhaps to escape mounting tensions with Claudia, perhaps to make a dramatic point about his autonomy. But even this theory felt incomplete. Voldemir had never been one to run from problems. He confronted them, negotiated, found compromises. Disappearing without a word was entirely out of character. Jonathan and his wife decided, despite their reservations about Claudia, to visit her home that evening. They hoped to support her in the search, to pool information, to find some clue that might explain where Voldemir had gone. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic. Police vehicles lined the street, firefighters were organizing search teams, and neighbors had gathered to help comb the surrounding countryside. The atmosphere was tense, but not yet suspicious. Everyone believed they were looking for a missing man, not investigating a crime. Jonathan entered the house and immediately noticed Claudia's agitation. She seemed anxious, restless, her eyes darting frequently toward the kitchen. She told those present that the previous weekend had been entirely ordinary. They had eaten pizza with friends on Saturday, spent Sunday together peacefully, and nothing unusual had occurred. To everyone listening, her account sounded plausible, even comforting. But small details began to accumulate, details that in hindsight would take on sinister significance. That night, Jonathan and his wife decided to stay in the house with Claudia, reasoning that she should not be alone during such a distressing time. Claudia, however, refused to sleep in her bedroom. She insisted on spending the night on the living room sofa, claiming she wanted to be awake in case Voldemir returned. From her position on the sofa, she had a direct line of sight to the kitchen, and specifically to the refrigerator. When Jonathan, thirsty during the night, approached the fridge for a glass of water, Claudia's reaction was immediate and intense. She seemed disturbed by the simple act of him opening the appliance, though she did not explicitly stop him. Jonathan, exhausted and focused on the search, attributed her behavior to stress and grief. He did not press the issue. But over the following days, Claudia's behavior around the refrigerator and freezer became increasingly peculiar. Volunteers helping with the search needed to be fed, and Claudia insisted on being the only person to retrieve food from the kitchen. She would not allow anyone else to open the freezer, a detail that several people noticed but did not yet find alarming. After all, many people are particular about their kitchens, especially under stress. But one volunteer, a neighbor who had known Claudia for years, found the behavior strange enough to mention it quietly to others. On Saturday, November 19, 2022, 3 days after Claudia had filed the missing person report, she was summoned to the police station to provide a formal statement. At this stage, investigators did not view her as a suspect. In missing person cases, it is standard procedure to interview the last person to see the individual alive, to gather details about their mental state, their recent activities, their potential destinations. Claudia arrived at the station and was interviewed by detectives from the civil police, the branch of Brazilian law enforcement responsible for investigative work. During the interview, the officers could not help but notice visible injuries on Claudia's body. They appeared to be scratches and bruises, consistent with some form of physical struggle. When questioned about the marks, Claudia agreed to undergo a forensic medical examination, a process in Brazil known as an exame de corpo de delito, which documents injuries for potential legal proceedings. She left the station after the interview, but within hours she disappeared. Her phone went unanswered and her whereabouts became unknown. This sudden vanishing act raised immediate red flags for investigators. Why would a grieving wife, actively participating in the search for her husband, suddenly go off the grid? Almost simultaneously, the investigation took a dramatic turn. A neighbor approached the police with information that would redirect the entire case. This neighbor, whose name has not been publicly released, told investigators something that seemed absurd on its face, but could not be ignored. Claudia's freezer, which was usually kept nearly empty, had suddenly become packed with food in the days following Voldemir's disappearance. The neighbor explained that he had known Claudia for years, had been in her home many times, and had never seen her stock the freezer with more than a few basic items. She was not someone who bought in bulk or prepared meals in advance. Yet in recent days, the freezer had been conspicuously full, stacked with packages and bags that obscured any view of the interior. It was an odd detail, the kind of minor inconsistency that might mean nothing in isolation, but that takes on weight in the context of a missing person investigation. The detectives, faced with mounting circumstantial evidence, Claudia's injuries, her sudden disappearance, the unusual behavior around the freezer, decided they could not overlook any possibility, no matter how disturbing. On the night of November 19th, they obtained permission to enter Claudia's home and examine the freezer. What they found would become one of the most shocking discoveries in recent Brazilian criminal history. As officers began removing the bags and packages stacked inside the freezer, they uncovered the unmistakable form of a human body. It was Voldemir Heckler, 43 years old, preserved in the cold, concealed beneath layers of frozen goods. Preliminary examination at the scene suggested that he had been dead for several days, consistent with the timeline of his disappearance. The placement of the body was deliberate and methodical. Claudia had emptied the freezer, positioned Voldemir inside, and then meticulously covered him with food items to disguise what lay beneath. The psychological calculation required for such an act was staggering. This was not a panicked attempt to hide a body in the immediate aftermath of violence. This was premeditated concealment carried out with enough composure to arrange groceries as a visual barrier, to maintain the freezer's appearance of normalcy, to serve food from that very appliance, while volunteers searched for the man hidden inside. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Within hours, the case transformed from a missing person inquiry into a homicide investigation, and a warrant was issued for Claudia's arrest. Investigators anticipated a prolonged search, expecting Claudia to flee across state lines or seek refuge with distant relatives. Instead, the resolution came with startling speed. Not long after the warrant was issued, Claudia appeared at the police station and surrendered herself. Before arriving, she had recorded a video statement that circulated rapidly on social media platforms, a calculated act of public messaging in which she declared that she would face whatever justice demanded. The video was brief, her tone calm and resigned, and it provided no details about what had happened. Upon entering formal interrogation, Claudia confessed to killing her husband. But the confession came wrapped in a narrative of victimhood, one that her defense attorney would amplify in the days and months to come. According to Claudia's account, she had lived under constant fear of Voldemir, who she claimed had repeatedly threatened to kill her. She described years of psychological and physical abuse, painting a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage. Claudia insisted that her actions were not premeditated murder, but desperate self-defense, a last resort taken by a woman who believed she would otherwise be killed. She recounted a specific incident from 2 weeks before the killing. Voldemir had allegedly slapped her in public during an argument, an episode she characterized as the breaking point. On the night of November 14, 2022, according to her statement, Voldemir had forbidden her from attending a New Year's celebration with co-workers, asserting control over her movements once again. Feeling trapped and terrified, Claudia claimed she made the decision to act before he could harm her. Her account of the killing itself was methodical and chilling. She told investigators that she gave Voldemir a sleeping pill, waiting until he lost consciousness. Once he was incapacitated, she bound his limbs using techniques she had learned during her time working with livestock on dairy farms, a skill set that lent credibility to her claim that she acted alone, without an accomplice. At one point she said she hesitated. The enormity of what she was about to do became clear, and she considered stopping. But the fear for her own life and the safety of her daughter, she insisted, pushed her forward. She admitted to placing a plastic bag over Voldemir's head, suffocating him while he was unable to resist. After his death, she moved his body into the freezer, a process that would have required significant physical strength and cold determination. Claudia's defense attorney embraced this narrative fully, appearing on local television and in print interviews to argue that his client was a victim of prolonged abuse who had been pushed to an unthinkable extreme. He emphasized the 2019 domestic violence complaint Claudia had filed against Voldemir, using it as evidence of a pattern of abuse. He pointed to the injuries on Claudia's body, suggesting they were defensive wounds sustained during a final confrontation. He argued that the concealment of the body, while disturbing, was the act of a terrified woman who feared being accused of a crime that was, in her mind, an act of survival. Public opinion in Brazil, as is often the case in high-profile domestic violence cases, split sharply. Some saw Claudia as a courageous woman who had escaped an abuser through the only means available to her. Others viewed her actions as calculated murder, motivated not by fear but by financial desperation or resentment. The evidence, however, suggested a more complex and disturbing picture than either extreme narrative could accommodate. Investigators quickly identified significant inconsistencies in Claudia's account. The injuries on her body, while real, were not necessarily consistent with defensive wounds sustained in a life-or-death struggle. They could have been self-inflicted, or they could have resulted from the physical effort of moving and concealing a body. The claim that Voldemir had been abusive was contradicted by multiple witnesses, including Jeanette, his first wife, who described him as respectful and non-violent during their years together. Jonathan and Mateus, his sons, also rejected the characterization of their father as a violent tyrant. They acknowledged that their father had made mistakes, that his decision to maintain two families had caused immense pain, but they insisted he was not physically abusive. The 2019 domestic violence complaint filed by Claudia, when examined in detail, revealed a more nuanced situation. The incident occurred during a heated argument about Gabriella's decision to leave home and study in another city. Voldemir, according to the complaint, had opposed his daughter's departure, viewing it as premature and potentially dangerous. Claudia had helped Gabriella move without Voldemir's knowledge or consent, and when he returned home to discover what had happened, a confrontation erupted. Claudia claimed that Voldemir had shoved her during the argument, and she filed a police report. But the report also included Voldemir's counter-accusation that Claudia had taken a large sum of money from the house, approximately 38,000 to 50,000 Brazilian reals, which he believed was intended to finance Gabriella's move. Claudia denied taking the money, claiming Voldemir had spent it himself. This financial dispute would become a recurring theme in the investigation, as detectives uncovered evidence of Voldemir's savings and Claudia's potential access to those funds. Friends and family members testified that Voldemir had been saving money to purchase additional land, a goal he spoke about frequently in the months before his death. He kept large amounts of cash at home, a common practice in rural Brazil where banking infrastructure is limited and many transactions occur in cash. One of Voldemir's brothers told police that he had personally seen between 38,000 and 50,000 reals in Voldemir's possession, stored in the house he shared with Claudia. In addition, Voldemir had deposited significant sums into bank accounts belonging to his sons and trusted associates, a strategy designed to protect the funds from potential legal disputes over inheritance. The existence of this money raised an uncomfortable question. Was Claudia's motive financial as well as, or instead of, the self-defense narrative she presented? Investigators also learned that Voldemir had recently purchased security cameras for the home, intending to install them in the coming weeks. Some family members speculated that Claudia feared the cameras would limit her freedom of movement or expose behaviors she wished to keep hidden. If true, this would suggest a degree of premeditation, that Claudia acted within a narrow window of opportunity before the surveillance system was operational. The decision to hide Voldemir's body in the freezer, rather than disposing of it elsewhere, also suggested fear of being seen. If Claudia had an accomplice, many reasoned, the body would have been removed from the property entirely, buried in a remote location or abandoned in a vehicle. The freezer concealment implied that Claudia was acting alone, improvising under the pressure of time and circumstance. The media coverage of the case was intense and often sensationalized. News outlets across Brazil ran headlines emphasizing the macabre detail of the freezer, the double life Voldemir had led, and the conflicting narratives of victimhood and premeditated murder. Public fascination with the case was fueled not only by the shocking nature of the crime, but by its intersection with broader societal debates about domestic violence, gender, and justice. Brazil has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world, and domestic violence remains a pervasive issue despite legal reforms such as the Maria da Penha law, enacted in 2006 to strengthen protections for women. Claudia's defense team leveraged this context, arguing that her case exemplified the failures of the legal system to protect women from abusive partners. They pointed out that her 2019 complaint had not resulted in significant intervention or protection, leaving her, in their view, with no recourse but self-defense. Critics of this argument noted that a single police report, filed in the context of a custody and financial dispute, did not establish a pattern of ongoing physical abuse. Moreover, the absence of any other complaints, medical records, or witness testimony corroborating claims of violence raised doubts about whether Voldemir had been the aggressor Claudia described. Jeanette, in particular, became an unintended counterpoint to Claudia's narrative. In interviews with police and later with media outlets, Jeanette described Voldemir as a man who, while flawed, had never raised a hand to her. She emphasized that he had continued to provide for their sons financially and emotionally, even after moving in with Claudia. She also spoke about Claudia's obsessive behavior during the years when Voldemir was dividing his time between two families, describing the surveillance and harassment that had made her own life unbearable. For Jeanette, the suggestion that Claudia was a victim who had acted in fear did not align with the controlling, aggressive behavior she had witnessed firsthand. The practical aftermath of the crime was as grim as the act itself. Once Voldemir's body was discovered, forensic teams faced the challenge of defrosting it, a process that took several days and required careful coordination to preserve evidence. The delay meant that the wake and funeral, which in Brazilian culture are typically held within 24 to 48 hours of death, had to be postponed, prolonging the family's agony. When the date of the funeral finally arrived, what should have been a private, dignified farewell became a public spectacle. Media crews descended on the ceremony, cameras capturing every moment as neighbors, friends, and strangers crowded outside the funeral home. The intrusion was painful for Jonathan, Matthias, and Jeanette, who were already struggling to process the incomprehensible reality that Voldemir had been hidden in a freezer while they searched desperately for him. For Gabriella, the situation was even more unbearable. She had lost her father in the most unimaginable way, and the woman accused of killing him was her own mother. The psychological burden of this dual loss cannot be overstated. Despite the horror of the accusations, Gabriella tried to stand by Claudia, clinging to the only parent she had left. Jonathan, Matthias, and Jeanette, despite their own grief and anger, understood that Gabriella was facing a unique and profound trauma. They did not blame her for remaining loyal to Claudia. They recognized that she was a young woman suddenly orphaned, with her mother in custody and her future uncertain. Claudia was initially held in preventive detention while the investigation continued, but in August 2023, a lower court in Santa Catarina granted her conditional release under electronic monitoring. The decision allowed her to work in a construction materials factory during the day and as a cook in a restaurant at night, ostensibly to support herself while awaiting trial. The ruling provoked immediate outrage among Voldemir's family and many members of the public, who viewed it as a failure of the justice system to recognize the severity of the crime. The details of the concealment, the calculated nature of the act, and Claudia's attempt to mislead investigators by filing a missing person report all pointed, in their view, to premeditated murder rather than spontaneous self-defense. Within weeks, the Superior Court of Justice, Brazil's highest court for non-constitutional matters, overturned the lower court's decision. The justices cited the gravity of the crime, the concealment of the body, and the evidence suggesting premeditation as grounds for returning Claudia to preventive detention. She was once again placed in custody, where she remains as of the most recent available information. Her lawyer, who had agreed to represent her under a contingency arrangement, promising to collect legal fees only if she were acquitted, continued to mount a vigorous defense, publicly expressing confidence that Claudia trusted his work completely and that the case would ultimately exonerate her. As of now, no trial date has been set. Brazilian criminal proceedings, particularly in complex cases, can stretch on for years, with multiple appeals and procedural delays. Claudia has been charged with aggravated homicide, concealment of a corpse, and making false statements to authorities. If convicted, she faces a lengthy prison sentence under Brazilian law, which does not have the death penalty, but does impose terms that can effectively amount to life imprisonment for serious crimes. The question of whether Claudia acted in self-defense or committed premeditated murder will ultimately be decided by a jury, assuming the case proceeds to trial. Under Brazilian law, homicide cases involving domestic violence or other aggravating factors are often tried before a jury tribunal rather than by a judge alone, a system designed to incorporate community standards and perspectives into the judgment. The evidence that will be presented at trial, if it occurs, will include forensic reports on the cause and timing of Voldemir's death, testimony from family members and acquaintances about the dynamics of his relationship with Claudia, analysis of the financial records related to his savings and property, and psychological evaluations of Claudia's mental state at the time of the killing. The prosecution will argue that the act was premeditated, pointing to the methodical concealment of the body, the lies told to police, and the financial motive. The defense will argue that Claudia was a victim of prolonged abuse who acted in a moment of desperation to save her own life, that the concealment was the panicked act of a terrified woman, and that the injuries on her body corroborate her account of a final violent confrontation. The case of Voldemir Heckler and Claudia Fernandez Tabares is not simply a story of a murder. It is a story about the hidden fractures that can exist within families, about the corrosive effects of deception and financial dependency, and about the ways in which narratives of victimhood can be weaponized, sometimes legitimately and sometimes manipulatively. It is also a story about the limits of the criminal justice system to resolve ambiguity. We may never know with absolute certainty what transpired on the night of November 14, 2022, inside that house in rural Santa Catarina. We do not have video evidence, we do not have independent witnesses, and the only two people who know the full truth are Voldemir, who is dead, and Claudia, whose account is colored by self-interest and the instinct for self-preservation. What we do have is a body of circumstantial evidence, a pattern of behavior, and the testimonies of those who knew both individuals. That evidence suggests a man who, while deeply flawed in his personal life, was not the violent monster Claudia described. It suggests a woman who, whether driven by fear, resentment, financial desperation, or some combination thereof, made a calculated decision to end her husband's life and then went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the crime. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individuals involved. It has sparked debates in Brazil about domestic violence legislation, about the standards of evidence required to substantiate claims of abuse, and about the ways in which gender dynamics influence public perception of crime. It has also left a family shattered, 3 children, Jonathan, Mateus, and Gabriela, forced to navigate a world in which their father is gone and the circumstances of his death remain contested and painful. For Jonathan, the image of Claudia calmly serving food from the freezer where his father's body lay hidden is a trauma that will likely never fade. For Gabriela, the knowledge that her mother is accused of killing her father is an unbearable burden, one that has forced her to choose between competing loyalties and irreconcilable truths. And for all of them, the question remains, what justice does a crime like this deserve, and will the Brazilian legal system deliver it?